Thanks for joining me on this episode of the Reasonable Theology Podcast. Joined this time by Professor Mark David Hall. He's the Herbert Hoover Distinguished Professor of Politics and Faculty Fellow in the Honors Program at George Fox University. He's also Associated Faculty at the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University and Senior Fellow at Baylor University's Institute for Studies of Religion. He's written in and edited and co-edited a dozen books on religion and politics in America. He's a nationally recognized expert when it comes to topics on religious freedom. You can learn more about him and his work at markdavidhall.org. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Clay.
Now, as we start off, could you introduce your background a little bit and share about your academic focus on things like religious freedom and the Christian heritage of the United States?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I had the great joy and honor of being an intern at the Christian Legal Society, which is one of the nation's oldest Christian legal advocacy groups. They fight for religious liberty for all citizens, really, both as a high school student and as a college student. And so I went off to college. I majored in politics, and I said, I'm going to become an attorney and litigate church-state cases, religious liberty cases. That's what I want to do. I even took the LSAT as a senior, but then I started thinking about my gifts, talents, and abilities and decided maybe the law wasn't for me. So I went and earned a PhD instead in politics, where I focused on the American founding. And I've done a number of works on the American founding, but I've actually come back to religious liberty and church-state relations. The U.S. Supreme Court has made it crystal clear that we must interpret the First Amendment religion clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. We must understand that clause or those clauses in light of the founding era history, in light of the founders' views. And yet they have profoundly misconstrued, or at least historically until recently, they profoundly misconstrued this history. And so part of what I've been attempting to do, along with other scholars, is correct the courts on these very important issues. And fortunately, now we have, and I'm not claiming credit for it, I'm just saying now we have a court where the majority accepts the accurate account of the founders' views with respect to religious liberty and church-state relations. And that's why we've been getting so many better decisions in these areas coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court.
Absolutely. And part of the work that you've done, as I mentioned at the start, is you've written and co-edited and edited a number of books. One of those is titled Did America Have a Christian Founding? And you're really seeking to separate, fact from fiction in this. This is an oft-debated topic, particularly with those with a secular, maybe non-Christian worldview, have very different feelings as to whether or not we were founded to be a secular nation or founded by people guided by religious principles. So how did that book in particular come about?
So at this point, I had done about a dozen academic books, edited books, monographs, and that sort of thing. And academic books are important. I think they can make a difference over the long run. But over the last 5 years, I've really felt called to write for the general reading public. And so I've been doing more work online. And this is actually my first book with the popular press, a book intended for everyone to read. And so basically, I distilled a number of my scholarly works into a very accessible 170 or so page book that really anyone could read. And I organized it around the question, did America have a Christian founding? One of the first things I do is I'm very careful to define what I mean by Christian founding. For instance, I say we could mean by this that the founders identified themselves as Christians. If that's what we mean, then indisputably, we had a Christian founding, 98% Protestant, 2% Roman Catholic. These are Americans of European descent, of course. Maybe 2,000 Jews and 4 American cities, so an overwhelmingly Christian population. But that's not a very interesting finding. It could be that these were bad Christians. It could be that they were Christians attempting to create a secular political order. And so I continued to dig into what we might mean by this. Were they Orthodox Christians? Did they act as Christians? And each of these I consider and reject. And I end up, as you know, with the argument that really what we mean by a Christian founding is that were the founders influenced by Christian ideas or ideas developed within the Christian tradition of political reflection. And so I do discuss the founders' religious views some, But really, given my argument, one could be a deist. One could be even an atheist. I don't think any of them would have called themselves atheists. I don't think any of them were atheists, but one could even be an atheist and still be influenced by Christian ideas. And of course, one could be a Congregationalist, a Quaker, an Anglican, and be influenced by Christian ideas in important, significant ways. Let me do distinguish. Sometimes the question is asked, was America founded as a Christian nation? I actually don't like that formulation because that sounds very exclusive, as if it's a nation founded by Christians, for Christians, and maybe everyone here should be a Christian. America's founders were aware that there were all sorts of different Christians, and as we mentioned, the 2,000 American Jews, and they made it crystal clear that these Jews are an equal part of the American political experiment and self-governance. In the ratification debates, people pointed out that given Article 6 ban on federal tests for religious tests for federal offices, that a Muslim or a Hindu or even an atheist could hold office. And the Federalists had to say, yes, that's correct. This is a nation for everyone. And thank goodness America's founders were influenced by Christian ideas, because it resulted in a constitutional order that really benefits everyone, regardless of your faith.
Yeah, and you really make that case well. Like I said before we hit record here, I just finished the book yesterday. It really lays out what you've just talked about so well. Very readable, very approachable for anybody that has an interest in this stuff. And as you say, yes, they were influenced by their Christianity. Yes, they intended to bring those ideals into how they founded this nation, but they were not setting up a theocracy at the same time.
No, no, that's absolutely correct.
Now, you mentioned that they did indeed have, Christian. They were Christians, and we'll get into some of those accusations about they weren't real Christians here in a bit. But it seems like often when someone is interested in making the case that our founders were indeed Christians, there seems to be a lot of maybe not so great information out there, especially with the internet, where there'll be quotes that are misattributed, or someone will try and make Thomas Jefferson a choir boy and a Sunday school teacher when that just wasn't the case. With all that being said, was there any the founders that you particularly look at and see as this was an upstanding, faithful Christian who sought to live by and lead by those principles?
I'll answer your specific question in just a minute. Let me address your first comment. If you look at the academic literature, particularly through the 60s and 70s, there was just almost a complete consensus that founders were deists who created a godless constitution, and they wanted a high wall of separation between church and state. And into this literature came some popular Christian authors, usually people without PhDs, who had they sort of intuitively knew this was not right, and they produced a number of books that are more right than they are wrong. That they say, look, America's founders were Christians. They drew from their Christian ideals when they created our constitutional order, and they certainly didn't want a wall of separation between church and state. And so these popular Christian authors, again, I want to make it clear, I think they're more right than they are wrong. But then sometimes they overstate the case, as you suggested. They want to make Thomas Jefferson into a choir boy. They say George Washington would have gone to an evangelical megachurch were he alive today. And they just make claims that are simply not true. And then it hurts the case, right?
Right.
And so usually when scholars with other views want to engage me, they just try to lump me in with these popular Christian authors. I try very, very hard to be very careful. I fully document my sources. I use them in context, and I'm willing to call a spade a spade. If a founder is not an Orthodox Christian, a Thomas Jefferson, I'll say that up front, and we shouldn't pretend he is an Orthodox Christian. To get to your specific question, there were many founders who seemed to have a deep and abiding faith, founders that we have no reason to think were not Orthodox Christians. One fellow I really like is Roger Sherman from Connecticut. I actually have a book written about him, Roger Sherman and the Creation of the American Republic. It's published by Oxford University Press, but it's out in paperback, and I think it would be readable to, again, the general reading public. And there I trace a career of this very godly man, this very pious man, a man who debated ministers on questions like when is it appropriate for a congregation to fire a minister, or when is a divorce biblically permissible. He actually debated a new divinity theologian basically on the question, does Calvinism require one to praise God even if one knew he was not among the elect? So, these are kind of getting into the deep weeds theological
Yeah.
questions. His pastor was Jonathan Edwards Jr., the son of the famous, more famous Jonathan Edwards. So Roger Sherman, a deep and pious man, a family man, he had something like 15, 16 children. Now, some of your listeners are, yeah, Sherman, some obscure guy. He is not widely known. And so if you or your listeners haven't heard of Sherman, that's not to your shame. He's not a Washington or Jefferson or Madison, but listen to some of the things he did. He is the only founder to sign the Declarations and Resolves, the Articles of Confederation, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. He
Wow.
was intimately involved in all these things. He was on the 5-person committee that put together the Declaration of Independence. Now, Jefferson's the most famous person on this committee, but that was Jefferson's only major committee. Sherman in 1776 was on 3 major congressional committees, and so he just didn't have the time to draft the Declaration. But he was on the committee and he had input, and he should be given credit as a key drafter. In Philadelphia, he and Madison agreed on a number of points. When he and Madison disagreed on a point, he won more battles than he lost. If the Madison's Virginia plan had been sent to the states, it would have been ratified by maybe 4 or 5 states. Sherman was able to change the Virginia plan to have strictly enumerated powers, to have equality of the states in the Senate, and to produce a document that was ratifiable. He went on in the House of Representatives to help draft the Bill of Rights. He played a very significant role. I'll just mention one important contribution. James Madison was saying we should have the constitutional amendments interspersed in the document of the Constitution, somewhere between Article 1 and 7. Sherman said, no, 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 we should put them at the end as amendments. And of course, Sherman won that battle, and Madison lost that battle. Now, I'm not trying to take anything away from a Madison or Washington. These are great, great men. I just want to suggest that there are giants of the faith in the American founding that made very, very important contributions, and these individuals deserve to be better known.
Yeah, sounds like a great person to look more up. I wasn't familiar with him either, and even though being a little bit of a history buff and a student of the Revolutionary War eras, there's so many men that for whatever reason just didn't didn't get the press, weren't as maybe as self-promoting, or at least didn't end up being in higher office to where of course we're going to learn more about a Jefferson or a Washington or whatever else. So I appreciate you kind of tipping us off to some more folks to look at. So as you said, the vast majority, if not all, would have counted themselves as Christians. There are examples of those men who were very godly, very pious Christians, and let that and live that out. At the same time, you've got men where the critics kind of latch onto and point to and say, well, no, the founders weren't intending to be setting up a Christian nation. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and deism gets thrown around a lot. Could you define for us what is deism and what role did it actually play in the founding and the foundation of our country?
Well, thank you for that question. So, deism refers to an enlightenment approach to religion that basically says we will accept of religion only what is rational. Now, this does have some content. We can rationally know that God exists, that God created the universe, that God wants us to be good rather than bad. We can know these things rationally. And so, deists are not atheists. And yet, you start talking about Jesus Christ, the incarnate Son of God. Well, that's not rational. So, that's going to be rejected. Or the Trinity, 3 in 1 and 1 in 3, that's not rational. So, we'll reject that. Miracles. Miracles aren't rational, right? We have the laws of nature. They violate the laws of nature. So, we reject that. Now, I actually think all these things are, in fact, rational, but they probably do require some degree of faith and the inspired word of God to understand them in some detail, right? So, in any case, you do have deists who are out there. One of the fun things I do in my book is I begin the first substantive chapter with about 15 quotations. If you go from the front page into the footnotes, where prominent scholars say things like most of America's founders were deists, or at least many of America's founders were
Right.
deists. And they define deism as I just defined it, right? A clockmaker God who created the universe and then moved away from it. Certainly a God who does not intervene in the affairs of men and nations. Now, they say most of America's founders were deists, but then what they do is they inevitably latch on to the 6 or 7 that we know well. Franklin, the 4 who became president, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, sometimes an Alexander Hamilton, and usually a Tom Paine. And then they look at these individuals and they say, look, these are not Orthodox Christians, and therefore the founders were deists. Now, let me just suggest, hopefully, if you knew nothing about deism before now, you would latch on to something and say, wait a minute. One could have a heterodox position on some tenets of theology and not be a deist. For instance, one might reject the incarnation and yet still believes that there's a creator God who intervenes in the affairs of men and nations. And if you believe that, you are not a deist by definition. And so what I do is I run through these 7 individuals and show that really none of them are deist by this definition. All of them speak with some regularity about God doing miracles, God intervening in the affairs of men and nations. Someone like George Washington does it something like 240 times in public documents and private documents. He's always speaking about God's providence. And so he's not a deist. And then I go even a bit deeper and I say, do we have any evidence whatsoever that George Washington, James Madison are not Orthodox Christians, and Alexander Hamilton? And the answer is no. We just simply don't have evidence. Now you can point to Alexander Hamilton. He had an affair. It's true. He had an affair. That's a bad thing to do. We ought not to have affairs, but that doesn't make one a heretic. That doesn't make one a deist, right? As well, I point out that these founders are an entirely unrepresentative sample. By the end of their lives, all of them are worshiping in the Church of England or the Anglican Church, with one exception, John Adams. That's almost all the sample, but only about 15% of Americans in this era were Anglican. 50 to 75% were Calvinist, and only John Adams is a representative of that population. He's not a good representative. Adams clearly rejects Orthodox Christianity, as does Jefferson, and so he's not a good representative of Calvinism. But most of America's founders would have identified themselves as one stripe of Calvinist or another, and most of them looked much more like a Roger Sherman than a John Adams. So I'm very careful not to argue that most of America's founders were Orthodox Christians, because we simply don't have the information about many of them. But those that we know something about, their theological views, their religious views, someone like a Roger Sherman, there's no question that he is in fact an Orthodox Christian. There are some heterodox Christians running around there. By my count, you really have 2 deists, I think, Ethan Allen and Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine isn't even from America. He's from England. He comes over here. He does some good stuff, but then he goes back to France and he writes The Age of Reason, a deistic work, and he's vilified in America because of that work. Americans had no patience with deism at that time.
Yeah, that's helpful. And I do appreciate about your book how you don't fall into that error that I see so often, is where they'll take a Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Jefferson and they'll kind of cherry pick some quotes and try to argue them into the kingdom of heaven, when just the reality is, while they were probably far more sympathetic and far more influenced by Christianity than a secular, maybe someone from the left might argue, they certainly, as you said, were not Orthodox Christians. But that doesn't undermine your argument that they and the founders were influenced by and trying to instill Christianity and Christian principles into how they founded this nation.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I give a number of very specific examples of way in which I think this occurs in the founding era. And many of them, or at least some of them, fly in the face of Enlightenment ideas, right? So the Enlightenment had a positive view of human nature, and they had a very high view of the intellect. And so what Enlightenment political thinkers tended to want is a very strong central government run by the educated elites. America's founders would have nothing to do with it because they believed, as James Madison put it, men are not angels. Men are sinful, or men are self-interested. And therefore, we want a constitutional system characterized by a separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, and on they went about the importance of avoiding concentrated power. And we certainly aren't going to count on education as making someone into a moral person. They were not against education; they were for education, but they would have no patience with the idea that a bunch of PhDs should be given all political power and allowed to control the United States of America. That would be a recipe for disaster and tyranny.
Yeah, I think in the book, I don't know if it was yours or a quote, but you mentioned how, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary, and if we were governed by angels, the checks and balances wouldn't be necessary. But they were influenced profoundly so by their theological beliefs that man is fallen and sinful, and they governed and set up our government accordingly. And I think that was a really helpful insight that I took away from the book, is seeing just one, how different that is from like an enlightenment point of view, or even really um a secular point of view today that sees people as basically good and attempts, and I think fails, to govern out of that belief. Whereas you recognize that the best of men are men at best, it causes you to approach the question of civil government much differently.
I think that's exactly right. And let me point out the quote we're talking about comes, we're paraphrasing it from Federalist 51, written by James Madison. James Madison was so intensely private about his faith. He seemed to have been a pious young man. He stayed at the College of New Jersey, now Princeton, for an extra year, presumably to study for the ministry. But then after that, we know almost nothing of his faith. And so I make no claim about him that he's a deist, that he's an Orthodox Christian, that he's a good Anglican. But nonetheless, Madison clearly understood that humans are sinful or self interested, if you prefer. And if you read something like Federalist 10, Federalist 51, it shows the genius of the founders to figure out, okay, how are we going to create a national government that's strong enough to do what we want a national government to do, and yet also ensure that it doesn't become a tyranny, it doesn't become tyrannical. We certainly are not going to trust people. And this is one of those examples where I think everyone in America benefits from the fact that we had a Christian founding, because atheists, Jews, Hindus, Muslims, all of us like not living under a tyrannical government. And it's because America's founders were influenced by the Christian idea of original sin that even redeemed humans continue to battle with the old man within, that we have a constitutional order that works. As much as we're frustrated with it, it's not a tyranny, right? And that's a really good
Right.
thing in the scheme of world history.
Yeah. And at the same time, I think it's clear to anyone paying even the smallest amount of attention, is that we have drifted a long ways from the beliefs and the foundational intent of our founders. And we're really in a spot where in the US, in our society, Christians are encouraged, if not pressured, I think probably more accurately, to keep their religion in their heart and in their home and in the pews, and that's about it. And you see that coming even from high levels of government people speaking that way. So can you speak to how that idea would have been foreign to our founding fathers? And in fact, this so-called wall of separation is not something that they passed down and intended for us to use as a bully club to keep faithful Christians out of the public square.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So, yeah, it would have just been unthinkable to America's founders that one should not bring one's faith into the public square, that one should not act upon one's religious convictions, um, eh, at a personal level, at a community level, but also at a societal level. And it's entirely appropriate to make religious arguments in the public square. And towards what ends? Towards the ends of justice, towards the end of neighbor love. And so it's entirely appropriate to advocate in the public square for the end of slavery, for instance. And many founders did. And a lot of people don't recognize that 8 states voluntarily ended slavery or put it on the road to extinction between 1776 and 1808. I wish it had been more, but the abolitionists kept pushing. They pushed and pushed and pushed, and the abolitionists were profoundly motivated by their Christian convictions. Eventually, we had a bloody civil war. Unfortunately, the Reconstruction Amendments, slavery is ended, but Jim Crow legislation remains in place. What do? We oppose it. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and so forth and so on, right? Religious Americans fought to end that grave injustice. And we've continued to be engaged in public affairs until the recent day, fighting for justice, fighting for liberty, fighting for equality for all, not for Christian privilege, right? Now, this is part of our history and it's ongoing, but you're right. I think that a lot of voices from the academy, from some of our civil leaders are saying, no, no, no. Religion is something that should be kept in your church or mosque or synagogue. Be as religious as you want, but don't you dare bring your faith into the public square. Don't make Christian arguments in the public square. That's Christian nationalism or something like
Right.
that. This horrible toxic mix that no one should be doing. And be religious, but keep your faith to yourself. Again, this is not a part of our history. It certainly is not required by the Constitution. And people do throw around this phrase, separation of church and state, wall of separation between church and state. But think for a moment, constitutionally, of the words of the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise clause, the free exercise thereof, to keep going. I want to focus on those first words. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. The Establishment Clause is a restriction only on the national government and through incorporation now on the state governments. There's no way you could read those words and think that somehow there's a constitutional prohibition on churches or religious citizens being engaged in politics, making arguments in the public square. It's a completely ahistorical interpretation, and it's one that we should have no patience with.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when we try to make that argument that that was not the intent of the founders, and we make appeals to their writings, to founding documents, I have seen people online, which is maybe not always the best arbiter of what the conversation actually is, but they almost discount the Declaration of Independence and toss it aside and say, well, technically this isn't a founding document. Look at the Constitution; that's where it's at, and it is, as you say in your book, it's a godless constitution is the claim that is made. So they point to a lack of explicit reference to God in the Constitution as evidence that our nation was intended to be secular. Could you speak to that, and what would you say to that criticism?
Let me say, first of all, I have little patience with with the argument that the Declaration of Independence is not a founding document. I'd say
Right.
maybe it's the founding document. If anything serves as a mission statement for our nation, it's in the Declaration of Independence, right? The basic principles that we're dedicated to. The Constitution creates a framework of government, national political institution, to help bring about these principles of the Declaration of Independence. So I would say, first of all, as you know, I argue that the Constitution was profoundly influenced by Christian ideas. The men who wrote and drafted and debated and ratified the Constitution were profoundly influenced by Christian ideas, the sinfulness of human nature being one of them, the fact that humans are created in the image of God being another. Their understanding of liberty was absolutely defined in Christian terms. The founders themselves certainly didn't understand the national government as being a government that couldn't have anything to do with religion. I give a ton of examples about this in my book. Let me just tell two stories, if I may, because I think they illustrate this point so well. So the first federal Congress debates what eventually became the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment. Literally one day after the House arrived at the final language that became the First Amendment, Elias Boudinot, later president of the American Bible Society, said, "Hey, things are going well. We should ask President Washington to issue a Thanksgiving Day proclamation." Adonias Burke said, "No, we can't do that. That's a European practice." Roger Sherman says, "No, it's a biblical practice, and therefore it's appropriate." And Sherman and Boudinot win. Burke loses. The House agrees with them. The Senate agrees with them. George Washington agrees with them and issues this wonderful, theologically robust Thanksgiving Day proclamation, which your listeners and viewers can just Google Washington
Yep.
Thanksgiving Day Proclamation, 1789. It's a beautiful document. All right, so this is 1789. Let's fast forward to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, who came up with this metaphor of a wall of separation between church and state. That's not accurate. He borrowed it from elsewhere, but he wrote it in a letter to the Danbury Baptist, and it's through him that it entered American law eventually, really not in the Establishment Clause context until 1947. But Jefferson did say there's a wall of separation between church and state. When did he say this? Well, basically, he wrote it in a letter that he then circulated among his political advisors, redrafted it, and mailed it off. 2 days later, Jefferson went to worship services in the U.S. Capitol building, where he heard John Leland, the great Baptist itinerant minister and himself an opponent of religious establishments, preach. Jefferson went to church services in the U.S. Capitol building. Jefferson allowed the War Department building and the Treasury Department building to be used for church services. And I could keep telling you story after story after story about this, right? So this is as they were drafting the First Amendment, after the First Amendment had been adopted, from someone like a Thomas Jefferson, no one, literally no one acted as if there was a wall of separation between church and state. Now, in some states, states were turning against having formal established churches. And thank goodness, whenever the government runs a church, that's always bad for the church. And that's why they got rid of religious
Yeah.
establishments. And again, thank goodness they did. And they did it primarily for Christian reasons, not because of a bunch of deists running around hating on religion.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, as a Baptist, look into the Baptist history. Even in our own nation, there's a reason that Jefferson was assuring the Danbury Baptists that the country wasn't going to have an official religion, because every time that happened, it turned out very badly for the Baptists. Even in our own nation, you look at some of the things that happened in the 1700s with people being beaten and jailed and churches broken up and scattered and all those things, even in the United States. So the context of that, I think, is very important. As
Absolutely.
we look at where we're at now, it's really easy to get pessimistic about where we're headed as a country, particularly in relation to religious freedom and even at this point the toleration of Christians and their beliefs and their views. What is your own view about the state and the fate of the American experiment?
Oh, that's a great question. So I tend to be an optimist. And I do. There are a lot of trends I do not like in our society today at all sorts of levels, political and not. I think as Christians, one thing we can do is pray for revival, share our faith. That ultimately is where the greatest hope for our great nation lies, I think. But we have to be involved in politics. I think we have an obligation and a duty to be involved in politics. I don't mean run for office, of course. Maybe some would be called to do that, but to be an informed citizen, to vote in elections, maybe write the occasional letter to the editor. If Christians would become more politically active,
Right.
we could help preserve innocent human life, right? Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court overturned that horrible precedent of Roe versus Wade. We should now be debating in every state of the union. Are we going to place restrictions on abortion? We should. What should those restrictions look like? Let's think things through really carefully with respect to the life of mother and so forth. Christians should be involved. We must be involved in debates like that. How are the poor going to be helped? Now, you could say that's ideally a job of the family, the community, the church. And I love all those institutions and wish they would do all the work. But where people fall through the cracks, sort of welfare programs should we have? Programs that would actually help people rather than trap them in a cycle of poverty. And on we could continue talking about the important issues of our day. Christians should be out there advocating for just and equal policies for all. And if we do so, we've seen some great results in some states, not so great in other states. With respect to religious liberty specifically, let me say we have excellent constitutional protections in America. We have a great U.S. Supreme Court. Religious liberty claims basically have won every time they come before the court, with maybe one exception over the last 20 years. That might not be exactly right, but it's pretty close. Religious citizens, and I'm talking all citizens, Christians, Muslims, and others are winning. Their religious liberty is being protected. And so we have good cause, I think, to be optimistic. We should never take it for granted. I'm a big supporter of these legal advocacy groups like the Beckett Fund, Alliance Defending Freedom, First Liberty, Christian Legal Society. And I think these institutions are well worth the occasional donation or prayer support and other forms of support.
Yeah, it's nice to get an optimist take. I find myself being fairly pessimistic at times when I look at just where our nation currently is and where it seems to be headed. So it's helpful to be reminded of just the importance of being involved. I mean, you mentioned obviously prayer. We want to be steeped in scripture. We don't want to be informed about what's going on locally and in our nation and seek to be involved in those things where we can. Uh, in what ways can the average Christian better inform themselves about not only current events, but really just kind of the foundational principles of our nation? Obviously, encourage them to read your work, this book in particular, and your others, and I'll link to those in the show notes. But how else can we better inform ourselves so that we know what avenues to use in terms of legal things or whatever else, and how to approach the questions of our day.
Sure. Well, let me say first of all, and found myself guilty of this, but we need to be very discerning in our sources of information. I think so. If you're reading a book about the American founding, look and see if the author has credentials. Look and see if the author bases his or her arguments on primary sources, makes logical interpretations of the
Yeah.
evidence, and I think we need to be careful. One of the good things about books is there's a lot of review that goes on. Um, any idiot can put anything on the internet. So I would not recommend just Google what did the founders think about
Right.
religious liberty and go to whatever website where you might not know anything about the person who's putting stuff up there. Now, there are good stuff, and I publish on websites, so I'm not poo hooing all that. But I'm just saying we need to be discerning. And maybe there's someone you know that you respect greatly and you have great reason to have faith in, and he has a website, then by all means go to that website. But we should be very discriminating in that respect. And I would say the same thing about our information regarding current affairs. I think far too many people get their information from their Twitter feeds, and these are usually cultivated, right? Such that you're receiving all of your information from pretty conservative sources or pretty progressive sources. And this is one of the reasons we're so polarized. So, to the extent possible, read your local paper. I love The Economist. It's an English weekly magazine. And I'm not going to say it's objective, but it's about as close to objective as you can get. I think they give a fair account of the news. If anything, they lean a little bit in a free market direction. But check out sources of news like that rather than our Twitter feeds to try to get a better sense of what's going on in this world. And then, of course, reading your local paper, I think is critically important, even if it's biased, just to know the issues of your community, to know how to get involved with respect to school boards and critical race theory in school and this sort of thing. There are some really bad things going on out there. We need to be
Yeah.
aware of them. And we can make all the difference in the world, much more so than with respect to the presidency of the United States. If Christians would take seriously what's going on in their local public schools, take seriously what's going on with respect to the school board, we can make a lot of difference pretty quickly if we would just be involved.
Yeah, and you think, I mean, there's a whole other conversation, but you think of how the intent was that the president of the United States would have very little bearing on my day to day life, and I would be more concerned with my local sheriff and my mayor, rather than not know who they are, but know who my senator is and congressperson and all that. So there's a lot to be said for being involved at a local level and the intent of that. And I really appreciate what you said in terms of discernment. For one, I think that for a number of reasons. One, it prevents us from looking foolish. Sharing around a quote that's attributed to Abraham Lincoln and it's not, or whatever else that happens often, unfortunately, in Christian circles. I think, secondly, is making sure that you are not just following the latest outrage then maybe it's getting blown out of proportion. I think, as
Mhm.
you said, there's a lot of uh, horrendous things happening right now that we should be upset about, incensed about, and try to do something about. And at the same time, we need to recognize that there's an industry out there that feeds on clicks and ads and all that stuff. And the last one I would say too is trying to understand that if you are only on Twitter getting all these things, you're going to be discouraged and feel like the whole world is against my point of view and my background and my religion, when really that's probably not a very good accurate temperature test as to what the feelings of the nation are. We'd like to think that this is in fact the town square, when it's pretty slanted in terms of what's coming across your news feed. So maybe we get a little bit more discouraged than we ought to be when we're only living in reading these social media circles.
I think that's exactly right. Very well put. Thank you.
Now you've got a new book coming out in the near future, "Proclaim Liberty Throughout the Land: How Christianity Has Advanced Freedom and Equality for All Americans." Can you give a little preview about that and what it adds to this conversation?
Sure. Well, it first of all, it covers all of American history from the Pilgrims to the present day. One of the first chapters, I argue, the Puritans are oftentimes portrayed as mean-spirited theocrats. They actually created one of the most progressive, in a good sense of the word, societies that the world had ever seen. That did a better job of protecting rights, letting regular people participate in politics, and on one could go. They even did a far better job of dealing with witches. Oftentimes we think of the Puritans, we think of the Salem witch trials. Witches, to the extent to which they were ever around, were far better off in America than they were over in Europe. That was literally hundreds of thousands of people were killed as witches throughout Europe. In places like Switzerland, as late as 1780, people were killed for witchcraft. The Puritans did a little of that, very little of it, and they got over it very, very rapidly. So I try to dispel some of the common myths we might have about the Puritans. I move up to the founding era and argue that the founders were a heck of a lot better on the issue of slavery than most people think. Many of them took great steps and even at great personal expense did everything they could to end slavery. The 1619 Project gets things absolutely backwards. And so I address that head on.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the cotton gin basically gave slavery a new lease on life in the American South. But American Christians did not give up and they continued to fight the horrible institution of slavery through the 19th century, the abolitionist movement. They also did things like launch a major political protest movement against the removal of Native Americans from lands to which they clearly had treaty rights in Georgia out to Oklahoma. The Christians lost that battle, unfortunately. I then pushed things up to the current day, looking especially at religious liberty, church state issues, and address some of the many you alluded to this earlier. For the first time, we're seeing people who are literally arguing against religious liberty, who are saying things like, what if religion isn't special? Why tolerate religion? Why should your religious convictions be treated any differently than my commitment to the Chicago Cubs? People are making, serious people
Yeah.
at prominent law schools are making these arguments. And so, in a very accessible way, I respond to them. The book will not be out until April of next year, but let me ask your listeners and viewers, if they could pre-order it on Amazon. This really helps with the algorithms. The more pre-orders Amazon gets, better they feature it, the more copies they
Yeah.
argue. And believe me, I'm pretty sure your listeners and viewers are going to love the arguments made in this book, and it will equip them well to respond to many of the nonsensical arguments we hear about how bad everyone in America has been throughout all the history until the present day. So I encourage your people to order it. Just look Mark David Hall on Amazon, and it should pop right up. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes as well. Reasonabletheology.org/founders. You can get all the resources and other, things that we've mentioned in this conversation. I'll link to that book. Looking forward to reading it. I think it'll be really helpful as we see more and more any call to a return to the scriptural basis and foundations of our nation is jeered at as some sort of Christo-fascism and other pejoratives that are being thrown around when really, as you no doubt make clear in your new book coming out, that those things benefit all faiths. People of no faiths benefit greatly from the ways in which our country was founded and formed.
No, thank you for that. I think that's exactly right. And we should concede, and I know you believe this, people have made Christian or biblical arguments to support evil things, to defend
Right.
slavery. So we can recognize that this sort of thing exists. But I think the overall story is far more optimistic. The Christians have been more likely to be engaged for the weakest within society rather than oppressing the weakest. And so I try to tell some of those stories and document some of these claims in this forthcoming book. And I do this to a degree in Did America Have a Christian Founding as well.
Well, great. Well, this has been a great conversation. Where can folks go to learn more about you and your work?
So I have a little website my wife made for me, markdavidhall.org. It has information about, we feature the popular books, but you can look up any of these other books if you're interested in, order them on interlibrary loan. Some of them are pretty pricey. Some of them are not, though, and they would make great resources for homeschool parents and others.
Great. And I know there's on YouTube as well. I watched a number of your videos that people can go find. Just look for your name online. And you've done some great interviews and lectures and things that encourage people to check out. And I'll link to a couple of those in the show notes as well. So appreciate your time. Our guest has been Professor Mark David Hall. We've been discussing his book, Did America Have a Christian Founding? Spoiler alert is yes, it did. You make that argument in an excellent, helpful way. So I appreciate all your research and time that went into that. And I appreciate you taking time to have a conversation with me about it.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.